Do you believe that a single marriage at the right time with the right person was enough to change all of Europe for centuries? Did you know that a family once ruled almost half a continent and yet broke apart because of its own blood? And you will hardly believe it. A Habsburg emperor was once buried without a head, without a heart, and some even say without a soul. Once upon a time, at a remote bend of the river Ahr, a man named Radbot of Klettgau had a castle built. It was not a magnificent residence, nor a royal palace, but just a small fortress situated at a crossroads of ancient trade routes where salt, wine, fabrics, and stories changed direction. Radbot called it Habsburg. No one knows for certain where the name comes from. Some believe it is derived from the Habicht, the hawk. Others say it was simply the old word for a ford, a crossing over the river. But regardless, history began there, because from this small castle and this seemingly insignificant family grew one of the most powerful, long-lived, and at the same time tragic dynasties in Europe, the House of Habsburg. From a simple family of knights, they rose to become emperors of the Old World, ruling an empire that stretched across half the continent, not through swords alone, but through marriages and the silence of genetics. Yet, like every great empire, their glory faded, not through rebellion or enemy armies, but because they failed to renew themselves. And shortly you will learn how a provincial family rose to the center of Europe, why they made marriage their most dangerous weapon, and what eventually led to their slow, silent end. Make yourself comfortable, breathe deeply, for you are now embarking on a journey through 9 centuries of European history, from a fateful marriage in Burgundy to a final whisper in Sarajevo. This is no dry chronicle, but the true story of power, faith, and the price of the crown. Let us begin together, the Habsburgs, from an unknown knightly family to the beginning of an empire. Probably only a few people know that one of the most influential and long-lived dynasties in Europe had its origin not in a great city or a palace, but in a small, barely noticed knightly lineage. Around the year 1020, a noble lord named Radbot of Klettgau had a castle built on a fog-shrouded section of the river Ahr in what is now Aargau, Switzerland. It was not built out of a desire to found an empire, but simply because a strategically important trade route intersected there. Salt, cloth, and precious metals all flowed through this fortress. And with every wagon that stopped, the influence of the man who opened the gates grew. Radbot called his fortress Habsburg. Where exactly this name originates is unclear. Some say it is derived from the Old High German word Habichtsburg, meaning hawk's castle. Others believe the word Hab or Hup once stood for a ford, a river crossing. In any case, this place became the origin of world history, from simple knights to power on the river. At first, the Habsburgs were nothing special, just vassals of the Dukes of Swabia, small knights among many. But they had something others lacked: location. The castle lay exactly where north and south, east and west crossed. Anyone wanting to travel between Italy and the German Empire could hardly pass this point. This was the decisive advantage, a comparison for today. If you own the largest airport in Europe, like Frankfurt, you don't need to own an airplane yourself to be important. You are simply in the right place. Through this advantage, Radbot's grandson, Otto II, was able to take the title of Count of Habsburg, a significant step that led the family from the lower nobility into the world of influential dynasties. And so began the slow but steady rise, not through wars or intrigue, but through patience, strategic thinking, and a deep understanding of the importance of location. A small lesson: not every great story begins with noise and splendor. Sometimes it is enough to be in the right place at the right time and to remain steadfast while others wear themselves out. But history knows no pauses, because while the Habsburgs were quietly working their way into the circle of nobility, fate was preparing a turn, an opportunity, rare, dangerous, but full of power. And this opportunity came at a time when the Holy Roman Empire was leaderless. In the next chapter, we meet a man whom no one expected on the throne, but who became the first Habsburg emperor, Rudolf, the simple soldier who set Vienna on fire. Rudolf Versailles, from nobody to emperor, and why Vienna once stood in flames. In the 13th century, Europe was a powder keg. The last emperor of the Holy Roman Empire had died without a legitimate successor. The crown was orphaned. What followed was a dangerous power vacuum later called the Great Interregnum. Dukes, kings, and princes all wrestled for influence. And in the middle of this chaos, a name appeared that hardly anyone knew: Rudolf of Habsburg. A simple count, without wealth, without an army, without a chance. Rudolf was at that time only a small imperial count, known perhaps to his vassals, but not a serious candidate for the imperial crown. And that is exactly why the electors chose him in the year 1273. Why? Because they wanted someone who seemed weak, a compromise emperor, one who could be guided, one without ambition. But they were thoroughly mistaken. Rudolf's path to power was simple, merciless, and effective. Rudolf was not a man of many words, but he was a man of action. He slept with his soldiers in the field, ate simple bread, sewed his own clothes, and even once gave his own horse to a priest. But behind the modest facade was a cool strategist. When the powerful Ottokar II of Bohemia refused to hand over the Habsburg hereditary lands in Austria, Rudolf did not hesitate. He called for war, and the decisive battle took place at Marchfeld. Rudolf defeated Ottokar, who fell in battle, and the Habsburgs received the Austrian lands. From then on, the Habsburgs were no longer simple knights. They were territorial lords and, for the first time, a factor in imperial politics. But Rudolf was not only skilled, he was also ruthless. When the citizens of Vienna refused him entry to the city, he had the surrounding fields burned down. No battle, no bloodshed, just hunger and surrender. A small lesson. The most profound people are usually not the loud ones. It is those who wait patiently and act at the right moment. Rudolf knew his rise was extraordinary, but not guaranteed. He feared that his death would ruin everything again. So he tried to name his son as his successor, to protect the land and to forge alliances. But there was one thing he underestimated: his own family. In the next chapter we see how discord and greed for power broke out among siblings in a family drama, reaching a peak when a nephew took up arms and the rise of the Habsburgs almost sank into tragedy. Sibling hatred and the War of Succession, Rudolf's tragic legacy. History has a cruel joke: when the founder creates fame, the successor often brings ruin. And for the Habsburgs, it began very early, right after the death of Rudolf. Rudolf brought the House of Habsburg from nothing to the throne, but he could not turn it into a tradition. After his death, the electors, fearing the growing power of the new family, did not elect his son Albert as emperor. Albert had to fight alone to restore his father's honor. Eventually he became Emperor Albert I of the Holy Roman Empire. But the path to this throne was not a coronation, it was a tragedy. Albert had a younger brother, Rudolf II, who was promised compensation for not receiving a share of Austria, specifically to rule Switzerland. But giving a promise is one thing, keeping it is another. Albert gradually withdrew power from his brother, recaptured land, isolated him, and turned Rudolf II into a political shadow. Then Rudolf II died under dubious circumstances. People doubted Albert. History books do not state this clearly, but silence is also an answer. John of Swabia, son of Rudolf II, was a young man then, but his father's resentment and humiliation burned in his heart with only one intention: to regain what was lost. On a day in May in 1308, as Albert was traveling along the banks of the Reuss, John suddenly murdered his uncle. Albert was struck down, fell, and with him shattered the dream of a unified Habsburg Empire. After the assassination, the empire fell into crisis. Lands were divided, loyalties wavered, and the Habsburgs, seemingly on the verge of a great ascent, had to return to the starting line. But history offered them an unexpected chance again, not through swords, but through wedding dresses. The next part leads you to a completely different chapter, when the Habsburgs changed their strategy from war to marriage. The one who laid the foundation for a global empire with unexpected weddings was a man named the Last Knight, the great master stroke of how Maximilian I matched Europe together. In history, we often remember the rulers who fought with swords, ruled with fortresses, and won with battles. But Maximilian, the grandson of Albert, ruled differently. He was not a conqueror in the classical sense. His most powerful tool was not the sword, but the wedding ring. A man with a plan, the marriage plan. Maximilian understood something many of his predecessors had not recognized. You can conquer countries, or you can marry them. In the year 1477 he married Mary of Burgundy, the only daughter of Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. With this marriage, Maximilian secured one of the wealthiest and most strategically important parts of Europe, the Netherlands, parts of France, Flanders, without having to lead a single war. A death and a new inheritance. When Charles the Bold fell in the snow at Nancy, the French king immediately reached for Burgundy. But Maximilian acted quickly. With diplomacy, stubbornness, and a determined army, he kept the western parts of Burgundy. The rest fell to France. But what remained was the core of a new Habsburg empire. The next marriage was the jump to the Iberian Peninsula. Maximilian thought further. He married his son Philip to Joanna of Castile, the daughter of the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. This opened the door to another empire, Spain, southern Italy, and not to forget, the New World beyond the Atlantic. And all this, once again without bloodshed, but through an alliance. A small lesson: not every victory is created on the battlefield. Sometimes it is enough to speak the right words at the right time and to extend the right hands. Maximilian was not a dreamer, he was a planner. He created a new form of power, dynastic networks that stretched across Europe like an invisible net. He founded a professional army, modernized the administration, and ensured that his descendants were not just heirs, but also the drivers of a new Europe. His most famous motto became the rallying cry of the Habsburgs: Bella gerant ali tu felix Austria nube, let others wage war, you happy Austria marry. And that is exactly what his grandson Charles V did with a consistency the world had never seen before. In the next chapter, we encounter the man who inherited so much that he was called the heir of the world. But with every gift, the burden also grew. Charles V and the impossible empire, the heir of the world. There are rulers who must work their way up laboriously through wars, intrigues, and alliances. And then there is Charles V, a young man who was born to inherit everything. When Charles was barely of age, he was already the heir to the Habsburg lands in Austria and the Holy Roman Empire, ruler of the Netherlands through his grandmother Mary of Burgundy, King of Spain, Naples, Sicily, and through his mother Joanna of Castile, also lord over the new America. Finally, after the death of his grandfather Maximilian I, he was crowned Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. The world said that the sun never sets on his empire. But that was not just poetry, it was also a premonition of the impossible, an empire too large to rule. Charles V was not a tyrant. He was educated, industrious, and pious. But his empire was a puzzle of too many pieces, too many languages, too many cultures, too many conflicts. He traveled continuously from Ghent to Toledo, from Vienna to Naples, always on the move to extinguish fires that were not only political, but also religious. The crisis of faith, Martin Luther and the schism. In the year 1517, a young Wittenberg monk named Martin Luther nailed 95 theses to the church door. A small action, but one that changed all of Europe. Luther did not attack a dynasty, but a belief system that had existed for centuries. And so Charles V stood between the borders of two worlds, the old and the new. At the Diet of Worms, Charles tried to bring Luther back to the traditional path, but Luther refused. As he left the conference, what Charles feared most happened. Regions within the empire began to choose sides. Germany split. Lords announced their conversion. A new religion was born, and with it, a decades-long war. The enemy was surrounded by France from the west and inside. Meanwhile, the French King Francis I constantly challenged Charles in Italy. The two empires fought for every inch of land, culminating in the Battle of Pavia in 1525, where Charles took the French king alive as a prisoner. That sounds like a big win. But less than 2 years later, Rome, the spiritual capital of the Christian world, was sacked by Charles's own army, mercenaries who rebelled because they were not paid. Then from the east came the Ottoman Empire under Suleiman the Magnificent, marching to the gates of Vienna and threatening the heart of Europe. A small lesson: when you own too much, you can no longer hold it. You are overwhelmed. Charles V did not lack power. He lacked time and the trust of the people he ruled. Religion could not be unified. The uprisings could not be suppressed. Charles was unable to maintain the integrity of the empire. He was exhausted. And then, in the year 1556, he did something only a few had expected. He voluntarily abdicated the throne. Charles divided the inheritance into two halves. His son Philip II received Spain, the Netherlands, and the overseas territories. His younger brother Ferdinand I received Austria, Bohemia, and the German Empire. The House of Habsburg split, and from here two separate branches emerged: the Spanish Habsburgs and the Austrian Habsburgs. Next, we will see that this separation seemed wise, but it was the beginning of two parallel tragedies. One side was burdened by beliefs no longer shared, while on the other, genetic secrets lay in their own blood. Power shatters, inbreeding, madness, and the fall of the Spanish Habsburgs. If the empire of Charles V was a map too large to be controlled, then the empire of his son Philip II was a marble castle whose foundation broke from within. And this crack did not lie at the border, but within the bloodline itself. When power is not shared, but kept within the family to protect inherited land, the Habsburg kings in Spain decided to marry close relatives. They believed the more they kept it in the family, the lower the risk of losing the throne. But what they did not count on was that in every such marriage, all that is weak and fragile also remains in the blood. A heart-wrenching example: Charles II, the lonely king in his own body. When Charles II, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, ascended the throne, he was only 4 years old. But from the beginning something was wrong. He had difficulty speaking and eating, and his face was deformed, with his lower jaw protruding too far. He suffered from poor health, chronic fatigue, and could not have children. Although he bore the title of king, Charles was dependent for most of his reign on his mother, Mariana of Austria, who actually held all the power. Many people at court whispered, Charles could not rule a kingdom, he could not even rule his own body. An empire goes down quietly. During the reign of Charles II, Spain gradually lost its strength. The economy fell into turmoil because it was too dependent on silver from America. Once loyal lands began to protest, from the Netherlands to Italy. The royal court was internally divided, and factions manipulated the king. It all happened without a great fight, just inner exhaustion. A small lesson: power is only truly strong when it is expanded, not just preserved. When you close your doors to the world to protect your throne, you also close the path to inheriting the vitality of your dynasty. In the year 1700, Charles II died. He left no successor. His death meant not only the end of a king's life, but also the collapse of an entire branch of Habsburg Spain. What happened then? A struggle for succession between European powers that lasted more than a decade. Although the French Bourbons won, the Habsburg legacy remained in Central Europe. In the next part, we return to the remaining branch, the Austrian Habsburgs, where the emperor still held the throne, and prepare for the greatest challenge, an Ottoman Empire marching at the gates of Vienna. The Last Wall, Vienna 1683 and the Christian West. On a summer morning in 1683, alarm bells rang in the streets of Vienna. From the church towers, one could see the flag of the Ottoman Empire flying in the hills outside the city. Vienna, the heart of the Austrian Habsburgs, the center of Christian Europe, was under siege. This was not just a military siege, it was a symbol, a confrontation between two worlds, between East and West, between two civilizations that had stood side by side and in opposition for centuries. At this time, the Habsburgs were no longer as strong as before. The internally divided treasury was exhausted after long wars with France and the Hungarians. When Kara Mustafa Pasha led Ottoman troops to the gates of Vienna, Emperor Leopold I had to leave the capital, leaving the city to military commanders and a fragile hope for reinforcements. All of Europe held its breath. An unexpected alliance and a hero from the north. And then from Poland appeared a king whom history will never forget, Jan III Sobieski. With only about 20,000 soldiers, he and troops from Saxony, Bavaria, and Austria formed a coalition of volunteers ready to risk everything to defend not just Vienna but their entire civilization. On September 12, 1683, the great battle began. The Ottoman forces were approaching the city walls when, from behind the Kahlenberg mountain, Polish cavalry swept down like a storm. In one of the largest cavalry charges in history, they broke through the enemy lines and forced the Ottomans into a chaotic retreat. Vienna was saved. An example engraved in history, this day was not just a military victory, it was a victory of rare solidarity among European peoples. Poles, Germans, Austrians, despite their differences, they stood together to defend a city and, with it, a value system at stake. With this victory, the Habsburgs regained their central position in Europe, at least temporarily. Vienna 1683 was more than just a battle. It was a test of history where faith, loyalty, and the fate of a civilization were at stake. But like all victories, this brilliant moment passed quickly, and after the glow of glory, a new century approached with new ideas, reforms, and a woman whom no one believed could rule. In the next part, we meet one of the most extraordinary figures in European history, Maria Theresa, a queen without a throne, but with the heart of a warrior. Reforms and setbacks, Maria Theresa, Joseph II, and the Enlightenment. There are people born to be kings. Someone was named heir to the throne, and then there was Maria Theresa, who no one thought would become one of Austria's greatest rulers, a queen without a throne, and Europe was skeptical. When Maria Theresa's father, Emperor Charles VI, died in 1740, he left his daughter a vast empire, however, without an official crown. The Holy Roman Empire did not allow women to be empresses. And so, in neighboring countries, the question immediately arose, can a woman lead an empire? France, Prussia, Bavaria, all attacked in turn. Those who were once allies now leaned toward being opponents. The Habsburg court fell into crisis. Maria Theresa was not a warrior, but she was a mother, a politician, and an administrator who never gave up. She reformed the entire administrative system and unified the laws in the different lands of the empire. She abolished religiously discriminatory taxes, improved the tax system, and built a new public education system that was unprecedented in Habsburg history. And although she lost the region of Silesia to Frederick the Great of Prussia, she still kept most of the empire and forced Europe to rethink the role of women in politics. Joseph II, light of the Enlightenment. After the death of Maria Theresa, her son Joseph II ascended the throne full of enthusiasm and reformist ideology. He was a true philosopher-emperor, believing in reason and justice. Joseph II abolished serfdom and gave the people more freedom. He eliminated censorship, expanded education, and reformed the legal system. Restricting the power of the church and promoting religious tolerance was very bold in the context of the time. Although his reforms were praised by intellectuals, they met with strong resistance from the nobility, the church, and the common people, who were not used to rapid changes. And so, after his death, most reforms were cancelled. What remains is only a trace and an impression that he was far ahead of his time. A small lesson: innovation is necessary, but if it is not accompanied by understanding and patience, it can lead to its own downfall. Maria Theresa won because she managed it step by step. Joseph II lost because he ran too fast, while the whole empire was still struggling to stand up. And then, after all that light and hope, a political storm brewed in the West. The French Revolution was about to break out. A granddaughter of Maria Theresa, Marie Antoinette, would stand before the Parisian public, no longer a princess of Europe, but a symbol of the past that must be overthrown. In the following we witness from the smoke of the revolution to the sound of the hooves of the military genius Napoleon, and how he forced the Habsburgs to rewrite their own fate. Napoleon against the crown, the beginning of the end. At the end of the 18th century, when the smoke of the French Revolution had not yet cleared, a new wave began to roll from the West, strong, fast, and unstoppable. This wave bore neither the name of a dynasty nor represented a religion. It bore the name of one man, Napoleon Bonaparte. From those moments on, the crown of the Habsburgs began to waver. A new empire needs no noble blood. With Napoleon, European kings had never dealt with anything like him, a man who was not born into royalty but called himself emperor. With outstanding military talent and a clever political strategy, he not only defeated the largest armies in Europe but also overturned old ideas of power. In a series of battles from Austerlitz to Wagram, the Habsburg army was repeatedly beaten. In the year 1805, after the defeat at Austerlitz, Emperor Francis II recognized that the Holy Roman Empire, a symbol that had existed for more than 1,000 years, no longer existed. So in 1806, he voluntarily dissolved the empire and changed his title to Emperor of Austria. A great chapter of history officially came to an end, but Francis still had something to do to keep the remaining bit of power: to marry his daughter Marie-Louise to Napoleon himself. Marie-Louise, the granddaughter of Maria Theresa, a true Habsburg princess, now became the wife of the man who humiliated her family on the battlefield. Although it was not a love affair, this marriage brought temporary, fragile peace between France and Austria. A typical example of when honor must take a back seat to politics. When Francis accepted this marriage, he is said to have whispered, "I am not giving my daughter to a man, I am giving her to history." A statement full of bitterness, but one that also shows the suffering of those in power in times of crisis. A small lesson: to keep the rest you must sometimes accept sacrificing what is closest to your heart. Not out of weakness, but because time leaves no other choice. Napoleon also failed, but the consequences he left behind were irreversible. European borders changed, ideas of state and power changed, and above all, the image of the divine crown was no longer untouchable. After Napoleon's exile, Austria returned to its central position in Europe under the leadership of Chancellor Metternich, but that was only a glimpse before a new storm. In the sequel, we enter the 19th century, where democratic revolutions broke out across the continent, and the Habsburgs were forced to face a new enemy, not a general, but the will of the people. Sarajevo, war, and the final end. On June 28, 1914, in the city of Sarajevo, the capital of the Bosnian province of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, an event occurred within a few seconds that changed the world order forever. A fateful morning, and a bullet ended a dynasty. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Habsburg throne, arrives in Sarajevo for an official visit with his wife Sophie. They sat in an open car and glided through the crowds in the narrow streets. And then, around the corner, A young man named Gavrilo Princip came out with trembling hands and a weapon in his pocket. 2 shots, a moment of silence, and then the Habsburg Empire, which once covered almost half of Europe, began to collapse. From a small town to the largest war the world had ever seen. After the assassination, Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia. Serbia refused. Russia intervened. Germany jumped in. France and England followed. Within a few weeks, all of Europe was involved in the First World War. For the Habsburgs, this was no longer a struggle to defend their honor, but for survival. The army was multi-ethnic, and there was a lack of unity. The economy was exhausted. In the hinterland, chaos reigned. The rebels rose and demanded independence. Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Croatia, Poland. Despite German support, the Austro-Hungarian Empire gradually fell apart like a torn map. The last emperor and his silent abdication. When Franz Joseph I, the old emperor who ruled for 68 years, died in the middle of the war, his grandnephew Charles I ascended the throne. Charles was a moderate man who wanted reforms and an end to the war, but it was too late. It was all out of control. On November 11, 1918, on the same day as the German armistice, Charles declared his abdication. Not because he wanted to, but because he had no choice. A quiet end for a once brilliant family. Charles Afrois lived in exile and died only a few years later on the island of Madeira. No throne, no army, no nation, only history and a Habsburg family that could no longer rule an empire. Austria became a republic. New countries like Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Hungary were born. The old world came to an end. A small lesson. No dynasty is permanent. True strength lies not in absolute power, but in the ability to adapt to the times. And when an empire refuses to change, history changes for it. But the story is not quite over. The Habsburgs, who no longer hold the throne, still exist as guardians of historical memory. They no longer rule, but they write books, engage in politics, and protect European cultural heritage and values in very different ways. And you will see that in the final part, as we explore the post-imperial life of the family that once reached the pinnacle of European power. The Habsburgs between the present and memory, Habsburg today. Politics, memory, and legacy. No throne anymore, no territory anymore, no army anymore. But the Habsburg family is still there. From empire to everyday life, a family learns to adapt. After 1918, the Habsburg family faced an unprecedented reality. They were no longer emperors. Charles, the last emperor, died alone. His son Otto von Habsburg, then only 9 years old, was not allowed to return to Austria, which for centuries had been the center of the dynasty. But Otto did not let history mean their end. He became a European citizen, lived, studied, worked, and fought, not for the restoration of the throne, but for the construction of a united and peaceful Europe. From the throne to the parliament, politics in a new form. Otto von Habsburg was one of the founding members of the modern European Union. He was a member of the European Parliament for many years, representing the CSU of Germany, and used his voice to defend freedom, democracy, and traditional values. He did not hide his royal origin, but he did not live for the past, he acted for the future. Today, people with the surname Habsburg live all over Europe, in Austria, Germany, Switzerland, Belgium. They are business people, writers, politicians, and social activists. None of them demanded the restoration of the monarchy. They no longer wear crowns but still carry their heritage as a moral responsibility. They preserve castles, libraries, and cultural values. They tell the story not as victors, but as guardians of the memory of a changed Europe. Final lesson: history does not end with the fall of a dynasty. It continues in the way descendants live, behave, and preserve values. And perhaps it was this humility toward the past that ensured the Habsburgs lasted longer than any other throne. Conclusion and invitation to reflect. From a small castle on the Ari to European power, and then falling into the darkness of war and division, the Habsburgs have almost a millennium of history behind them. A journey with lessons not just for kings, but for all of us about power and its limits, about unity and its price, about heritage and how we preserve it. If you have been here until the end of this story, thank you very much. What do you think about the fate of the Habsburg family? Are they a symbol of past glory or an example of those who know how to rise from the ashes? Please share your thoughts in the comments section, and if you want to continue exploring emotional historical stories, don't forget to click subscribe so you don't miss the next part. We will see you on your next journeys, where history is no longer just in books, but in the most vivid stories ever told.